Good evening and welcome to the third public seminar of APORDE 2023. My name is Pamela Mondiwa and I'm an industrial development planner at the IDC here in South Africa. I understand that this year's APORDE has gotten off to a really great start with robust discussions on the development challenges that are facing African countries. I do expect that we will continue down that path on this particular seminar. And really, it looks like we're going to have a robust discussion with the topic that John Sender is going to cover today. So I think we're in for an absolute treat because Professor John Sender will address us on generalizations about deindustrialization in Africa. This will encompass a critical engagement on the positions of eminent economists who have been pessimistic about Africa's industrialization and the resulting policy prescripts that they then offered the country. He will follow this up with his views on what is possible and the paths that African countries can take in order to industrialize. Prof. Sender will address us for approximately 30 minutes, and this will be followed by Dr. Lumkile Mondi, who will comment on the address as our discussant for this evening. Dr. Mondi will be online and we have Professor Sender here with us. After that, we'll then have a 30-minute session of Q&A. So I do hope that everyone will be noting their questions so that we can have this robust discussion that we have been talking about. Just a bit of housekeeping. For those of us that are joining online, please type in your questions in the chat box as they come to you, and we will give you an opportunity. We will give an opportunity for your questions to be asked, well read out, and then we'll also, of course, take questions from the audience here today with us. I would like to now introduce Professor Sender, who will come and address us, and I'll introduce Dr. Lumkile Mondi when he is about to address us. Professor Sender is an Emeritus Professor of Economics at SOAS. His earlier appointments include Director of African Studies Center at the University of Cambridge, Visiting Professor of Political Economy at Wits University, Senior Research Fellow at the African Studies Centers at Leiden, and advisor to former President Nelson Mandela's Presidential Commission on Labor and War Credit. So he's not only held prestigious positions elsewhere in the world, but understands the African context from the various work that he's done, not only in South Africa, but as well as in Nigeria and Ethiopia. Professor Sender?
Thank you very much, Pamela, and hello to all of you and to people who are in the ether somewhere. Good evening to you as well. The title of my talk is up on the screen, so I won't repeat it. I'll show you a picture some of you may have seen. It's to tell you about a book that I want to recommend to you in the strongest possible terms for two reasons. One, I was involved in writing it, so it's very good. And the other reason, which is more important, is that it's free. And so in the general theme of being rude about orthodox economists, this is how we prove Milton Friedman wrong. Because as you all know, Milton Friedman said there was no such thing as a free lunch. Here you have one, lunch and dinner as well. Okay, this is, I'm going to start by introducing you to the views of people who are much more important and better known than I am. And in particular, I'm going to start with the views of Dani Rodrik from Harvard, and I'll read out a few quotes from him. According to Rodrik, there are many signs that manufacturing is not the growth escalator it once was. So if you hoped that you were going to get returns to scale, productivity increases through building up a manufacturing sector, which would be the basis of a fast rate of growth of output, I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed, according to Professor Rodrik. It's not the growth escalator it once was. The phenomenon of what he calls premature industrialization seems to have taken over the developing world. Middle-income countries are experiencing declines in manufacturing employment shares. That's to say, a decline in the proportion of employment that the manufacturing sector offers, at much lower levels of industrialization and of per capita GDP, while low-income countries, and I highlight the things that I think are particularly important, low-income countries are finding it virtually impossible to replicate the experience of previous generations of manufacturing stories, success stories. So the highlight is an impossibility thesis. It's virtually impossible, or certainly terribly difficult for developing countries to do what some people used to say in the old world of development economics, that's to say, take advantage of of backwardness or leapfrog. It's going to be virtually impossible for that to happen in the future. Continuing the same rather pessimistic theme, Roderick says that the traditional model of export-orientated industrialization is based on nurturing productive manufacturing firms that act as growth leaders. So traditionally, you would nurture a manufacturing firm that you thought could be a leader. Future growth policies will have to have very different priorities. Instead of focusing on the most productive segment of firms, the next generation, that's your generation of growth strategies, the ones you should be in charge of, will have to target small and medium-sized firms. I'm sure you've never heard of that before, targeting small and medium-sized firms. Never been tried. Economic growth will be possible only by raising productivity in smaller, informal firms that employ the bulk of the poor and the lower middle class. Views echoed by the DPRU at Cape Town, by Haroon Borat and colleagues. They say the current sub-Saharan African manufacturing sector growth trajectory, if it continues, will be unable to generate the number of jobs hoped for by African policymakers. Our main findings, this is some research that they did this year, align with the more pessimistic view that emerges from Roderick, that points to the ongoing process of premature industrialization for Africa. By premature industrialization, you mean that the share of manufacturing employment in total employment begins to decline at a much earlier rate than was ever seen in earlier historical periods. And finally, I think this is finally, I hope you're not getting bored with people saying the same things. I'm just trying to say that if I'm attacking something, I don't think it's a straw man. I think it exists. It's a big, fat man, not a straw man easily knocked over. And the biggest and the fattest, of course, are the people who are the ideologues of the United States of America's aid agency. The chief economist is somebody called Louise Fox. And according to her, owing to the demographics and the current structure of low-income sub-Saharan African economies, even exceptionally high economic growth rates in the non-farm sector, that includes, of course, the non-farm sector includes, of course, the manufacturing sector, have not and will not generate enough new non-farm wage employment to absorb both the new entrants and those who seek to leave the agricultural sector. So give up. It's not going to happen. What I want to suggest to you is that underpinning these sorts of pessimistic views are some very old theories and very old views that I suppose came to prominence really in the 1970s. And they're views which are pessimistic about the prospects for the growth of capitalism in Africa or anywhere else in any other developing countries. Global demand is sluggish for the sorts of things that African countries produce. At the moment, African countries face unstable fuel and food prices. The terms of trade always seem to move adversely for whatever African countries produce, some sort of version of the Previous Singer theory. It's going to be difficult for African countries to grow, to do anything, for all these reasons about the terms of trade. This is made worse, of course, because whatever period you talk about, protectionism is rising. They keep introducing new rules, phytosanitary regulations, one type of pseudo-protection, non-tariff barriers of one sort and another. And of course, the rest of the world, the advanced capitalist economies, were responsible for the development of underdevelopment, the development of underdevelopment in Africa through extractivism, through, you're all familiar with these theories. They were the bread and butter of 1970s young intellectuals. And as a result of these extractivist policies, these colonial legacies, Africa suffers from a lack of skills, a poorly educated labor force, etc. But perhaps the key continuing theory concerns technological dependency. These are all variants of dependency, but the key story is technological dependency. Key story always was technological dependency. New technologies, and this is from Roderick again, disproportionately favor rich economies, well endowed with skills and capital, rather than developing countries. So whenever you get a new technology, it's going to favor the advanced capitalist countries. It's going to create difficulties for latecomers. It's going to create difficulties for the development of capitalist accumulation anywhere else in the world, because systematically new technologies favor advanced capitalist countries. I just want to show this is not just Dani Roderick or 1970s. So I've got a quote from a couple of people who many of you will know, Norde and Fiona Tregenna. New and emerging technologies, such as artificial intelligence and robotics, are making manufacturing more complex and less labor intensive, and therefore a less desirable sector for Africa to try to develop. They are a threat to future industrialization in Africa. The innovation process tends to begin in wealthier countries because high incomes create a favorable environment for product innovations. By the time the new products and techniques are adopted by the poorer countries, they tend to be subject to intense competition. This is a quote from the doyen of 1970s African dependency theory, Giovanni Arrighi. So we've got a conundrum, a paradox, an impossibility theory. And I just want to advise any of you who are thinking of going into academic life that the way in which you get really famous, the way in which you can really make a mark in the world is by pointing out a paradox. Think of Amartya Sen. Despite the rate of growth of output, the welfare of people didn't improve. What a paradox. That's, if you say the paradox often enough again, you might get a Nobel Prize. Anyway, here's a paradox for you. Competing with established producers on world markets is only possible by importing technologies, correct. And the imported technologies make it virtually impossible for significant amounts of employment to be generated. That's definitely true, isn't it? If you look at China, I mean, they imported a lot of technologies and there's no employment at all in the manufacturing sector in China. They did a terrible thing by importing so much technology. Okay, let's look at the evidence. We've heard the pessimistic stories. We've got some of the theoretical background to it. Let's look at the evidence. Let's just look at some African countries I happen to have some historical information for. In Tanzania, Kenya, and Ethiopia, in the 1960s, the wage force in the manufacturing sector was about 50,000. Has it been impossible to grow it? Has it remained stagnant? Well, it doesn't appear so. By 2011, there were 700,000 perhaps in Tanzania, 1.9, nearly 2 million in Kenya, and 2.8 million in Ethiopia. Does this look like stagnation to you? I've got more recent evidence, and this is taken from the DPRU paper, where they used the most recent available sectoral data on employment for sub-Saharan Africa. And for me, the most striking thing about this picture is that it shows that manufacturer share of total employment was very different. The orange blob is the earlier period, 2010, and the green blob is the latest 2019 period. And what it shows is that the length of those lines differs as between African countries. Does it not? This is not a homogeneous story. It's a heterogeneous story. Different African countries achieved very different rates of growth in the share of manufacturing employment in total employment. So generalizations about Africa, as always, are very, very dangerous. Most of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa did experience an increase in the share of manufacturing employment in total employment between 2010 and 2018. And the share increased very substantially in some countries. The two that stand out in the data from that chart are Ghana and Burkina Faso. What I want to suggest to you is that the figures that I've been putting up for quite substantial increases in the absolute number of people who are employed in the manufacturing sector and in the share of manufacturing sector employment in total employment in some countries. These figures are, as far as I'm concerned, almost certainly underestimates. And I'm going to try and give you some reasons as to why I think they're underestimates. How do you underestimate manufacturing employment? Well, one of the things you can do is you can exclude from your surveys a number of manufacturing establishments. You say, well, they're not going to be counted as manufacturing establishments. And in most countries, those establishments employing a small number of workers. In some countries, the threshold for inclusion is 5. In others, it's as high as 25. They're just not counted. So if you happen to have a fast rate of growth of employment in a manufacturing enterprise employing 20 people or something like that, that's not included in manufacturing employment statistics at all. Secondly, there are firms, it will come as a surprise to all of you, that don't really like being pursued by government taxation officials. Most firms rush to pay their taxes, but there's some who try to hide from the tax officials. And if you don't get registered and you keep out of sight of the tax officials, the number of people you employ isn't counted either. And in some of sub-Saharan African countries, and I dare say perhaps even in South Africa, there are some firms who like to keep their distance from the tax net. You've had a long trip, some of you, to go and look at agro-industry nearby, and you've had a lecture from Chris Kramer, and you're probably really bored with this point, but I think it's sufficiently important to make it again. Firms are misclassified as agricultural when really they're manufacturing, and there's the boundary between the two and is very loose. So you can have a very fast rate of growth of employment in firms that are high productivity, technologically sophisticated, dynamically innovative, but they're not counted as manufacturing. They, for some reason, they've been shoved into the agricultural sector. In a context of rapid structural change, such as you see in urbanization, such as you're seeing in many African countries, when you take a survey, you've got to be aware that your sampling frame, to repeat the survey, your list for which you take the sample, should be updated quite often, because firms drop off the list. There are new firms that get established that aren't on the list from which you sample. So there's no chance that you'll count them. In many African countries where I've seen the data, they rely on ILO data or other, and the sampling frames are extremely out of date. And there's good reason to believe that manufacturing employment is underestimated. Okay, this is perhaps more interesting and is my final slide. It's to, I suppose, to raise again the issue of ideology, old theory, or why do people believe these things? Why do they push them? Why is there a view of a particular kind from the mainstream economists at Harvard, at USAID? Why? Well, I'm tentatively advancing an explanation, although perhaps it will sound like a conspiracy theory to some of you. I'm not completely convinced it's true myself, but it may be true. The policy implications of Roderick, and they come out very clearly in all his work, are give up on state intervention to support large-scale industry. Basically, you have to focus your interventions and subsidies on small-scale informal enterprises. Sounds a bit like the DTI in South Africa. Those are what really counts for your policy efforts. And preferably, you're not going to ever really make it in exports, so produce for the domestic market or the regional market or the new African free trade area. That's where you ought to focus. Small, medium, appropriate technology, low scales, low tech stuff. You'll never make it as a big boy in the wide world market. We have a phrase in the book, well, at least we had a phrase which we discussed in the book, which was a sort of paternalistic, don't bite off more than you can chew. Be very frightened of how pervasive, costly state failures are. Don't worry about market failure. Worry about, given your capabilities, how costly state failures are. So a major thrust of the book that I told you to read for at least two reasons, a major thrust of that is to argue against impossibility theories of one sort and another. And instead, we try to make the argument, which I don't have time for tonight, which is that large-scale enterprises with a track record of adopting cutting-edge technology, learning by doing, entering export markets, you've got a track record of doing all these things successfully, they should receive state support from sub-Saharan African states. Of course, it should be conditional. And the conditions have to be of the kind that if you fail to export when you've had these subsidies, they get taken away. If you fail to treat the workers you employ decently, we're going to stop subsidizing or be nice to you. So there can be conditions attached, but the focus is support, or there should be conditions attached, sorry, but the focus of support should be on identifying what used to be called winners and supporting them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Senda. That was really interesting, and I think I particularly like that you dealt not only with the conclusions that have come from these economists, but with the data. So we can have a discussion that is evidence-based, and I know there are a lot of researchers that are in the room that have looked at the data in different countries. So I'm hoping that this will allow us to have a really deep engagement on this topic. There are two things that I think really stood out for me from what you've said. The one is on the data where you've highlighted the variances in industrialization or deindustrialization patterns across African countries. And of course, you pointed to the weaknesses in the data and some of that has been used traditionally by some of the more popular studies. And you've also highlighted that African countries should go against the impossibility theories and actually follow, the old paths of industrialization that we saw in the West, as well as we've seen that in China in terms of leveraging large firms for growth. Now, I think I'd like to call on Dr. Lumkile Mondi to give us his thoughts on the presentation that has been given by Professor John Sender. Dr. Lumkile Mondi is a senior lecturer at the School of Economics and Finance at the Wits Business School. He was the chief economist at the IDC a few years ago. His research interests include industrial policy, political economy, climate change, energy justice and just transition, technology and innovation in the energy sector, in a number of areas. He's previously served as a member of former President Mbeki's economic advisory panel. The technical team is just trying to connect him, so if you can just give us a few minutes. So I would suggest that in the meantime, we can start with our Q&A session, maybe start with some initial inputs, and then once we are able to connect him, we can get his inputs. So I'd like to start by checking if we have any clarification questions that people would like to pose. Are there any of those so we can get those out of the way? Nandra, do we have any questions online? I see there's a hand. For those online, please type in your questions in the chat box. Okay, we have a question online that will be read out briefly.
Thanks, Pamela. I hope you guys can hear me. So we have two questions online. The first question is around new technologies favoring advanced countries. So the question is, how do developing countries tap into these new technologies without necessarily favoring advanced economies? And then the second question speaks to, so how does Prof. Sender think the Africa Free Continental Trade Agreement will impact on the development of manufacturing sectors in most of the smaller economies on the continent? And then the last question online speaks to established market players. So it reads, established market players just enforce existing political economy, including the politics of underdevelopment. I think that's a question. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I think we can ask Prof. Sender to respond to those initial questions, and then we can move on from there.
Let me respond first to the Africa Free Trade Continental Market question. Can I be silly for a moment? I forgot to bring my crystal ball. So, I mean, I don't know, and I don't think anybody else does either. But my suspicion is that it will follow the pattern that we've seen in other regional African customs unions, free trade areas, that they've made very little difference indeed to total trade flows. There's been very little change in the pattern of trade following their establishment, and that most trade continues between much wealthier countries. The biggest markets facing Africa, biggest market opportunities for Africa continue to be in the advanced capitalist countries and in China. So my guess, although I haven't got my crystal ball, is that I wouldn't hold your breath hoping for benefits. On the question of how you tap into the advanced technologies developed by other countries abroad, Well, I start by being stupid again. I mean, one of the ideas is when they ask you to pay for them, you try and steal them. You don't pay, and you fight them for the intellectual property rights and whatever, that you cheat as much as you can. Most countries cheat. They don't obey World Trade Organization rules. They never have. They say, okay, I'll break the rule, take me to the World Trade Organization. 15 years' time, you might get a judgment, and then I won't care. So there's not enough cheating. There's too much being a good boy. Evidence, particularly in South Africa, with regard to drugs and the failure to follow the path that's been set out for poorer countries by Brazil and by India. More sensibly, perhaps, let me answer this question by saying that when you think of the investment in terms of R&D, intellectual capital, the building up of MIT science parks, and you can acquire that technology without having to jump through those hoops. In other words, without having to incur all of the enormous costs in building up a research and scientific skills, you could just get it off the shelf. You can buy it, pay for it. It's cheap. It's worth getting in most cases. Oh, sure, the advanced capitalist countries are going to benefit by selling it to you, but you benefit maybe by more, because you're getting stuff that cost a lot to develop. It would have taken you years and years and years to develop. You can get it off the shelf. So it's turning the question around of whoever made it. Let me remind myself of the last question, which is maybe why I was frightened to answer it and forgot it as a Freudian slip. It's what are you going to do about the power of the political power of large-scale, highly competitive, the big winners? How are you going to discipline them when they control the levers of political power, where money politics allows them to have a completely disproportionate say in state politics? Well, I think that's very difficult. I mean, how do large-scale corporations get disciplined? Well, again, I think the historical evidence is important. In the advanced capitalist countries, the only way in which you could make capitalist employers behave themselves was through the growth of workers' movements, trade unions. Danny Roderick doesn't talk about that, and nor does Louise Fox from the USAID. But historically, that's been the important way in which balance of power can shift, and which, if you like, large-scale dominant enterprises can be cajoled into behaving more sensibly.
Thank you very much for those inputs. I mean, I think I'm wondering also with regards to the question around how the power of those firms that become dominant through state support can be handled. There's the question around also the competition authorities and the extent to which they've been able to or can address this market power. There's also what we've seen previously, particularly coming from the East, which were the reciprocal mechanisms to ensure that if you are supporting a particular industry, then you require them to do certain things as a way of ensuring that they would not grossly extract rents from that process. I would like to apologize, but it seems that we aren't able to connect Dr. Lumkile, so we're going to continue with the Q&A session. We have a question from the audience, and I'm going to ask the gentleman to just come up to ask his question.
Thank you very much, Prof. It seems like part of the view around technology is really around technology import, of which I also share the same view. However, my question is around How do we navigate issues of tacit knowledge? Yes, the technology is available, it's got a patent. You know, if it's very old, perhaps it's a general purpose technology that information is largely available. But if we're dealing with emerging technologies, perhaps there's quite a great deal of information asymmetry, you know, and that even when we do import those technologies, the advantages might not be so easy to realize. How do we then navigate? So it might actually be more expensive, even though we are opting to import. So I'd like to appreciate your thoughts around how we navigate aspect of tacit versus coded knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have another 2 questions from the audience, and I'd like the lady sitting there and the gentleman there to come up to ask their questions.
Thank you so much for a very provocative presentation. My name is Mwanda Piri. I wanted to start with your policy recommendation that we should focus on large-scale enterprises in terms of policy priority. This for me is very provocative in the sense that if you look at the business landscape in Africa, right, the majority of businesses tend to be micro, small, and medium enterprises, in fact, accounting for more than 90%. And while they may not be very productive, they do contribute significantly to employment. And they're also more constrained in terms of access to capital, access to markets, information, all the things that the large scale businesses, enterprises usually, I beg your pardon, do not face. So I just want to have a better appreciation of why the policy priority should be large scale enterprises as opposed to the MSMEs. And to Roderick's credit, Professor Roderick, I mean, I agree, manufacturing is harder, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. But maybe the question should be really, or the discussion should be, how do we address all the challenges, given that it's much harder now to industrialize? Thank you.
So my question is not so different from her. Maybe it's because we used to work together. Equally, it was a bit sort of spooked by the recommendation around the large enterprises. Of course, there's literature to back that. But then the addition to our question would be around inclusivity. Because, for instance, if you're looking at the poverty landscape within sub-Saharan Africa, I think it has a link to MSMEs. So what then would we be doing if the focus is on the large enterprises? And then I would extend and ask, what then should we do to support the MSMEs? Because you did mention the aspect of learning by doing. So if we want them to move to that stage where the ones that we support are, what then should we do to help them so that they graduate to that level? Thank you.
Yes, I think we can get a response from Professor Seta and we can take another round of questions. I think we may have some more questions online as well that we'll get to.
I think I would like, if you'll forgive me, to concentrate on the last 2 questions, which were covered the same sort of ground about why concentrate on large-scale enterprises when so many enterprises in most African countries are small, and how do you include them, or does this have an adverse effect on poverty? I think there's several ways in which to answer. The way I prefer is, again, by looking at economic history. If you look at the economic history of a large range of countries, what they show is that as output grows, the proportion of employment that is contributed by large employers grows. So I'm suspicious of any idea that says, well, Africa is going to be different. When Africa grows, the proportion of employment that's offered by large employers won't grow, and the proportion of employment offered by small employers will grow. That's not what's happened anywhere that's grown. Places that grow have most of the labor force employed by large firms. Places that grow fast have more of the labor force employed by large firms. Secondly, on inclusivity, and sort of the African, there are two things I'd like to say. Firstly, have any of you ever been to a village, a rural area, where what you really need is more hairdressing firms, more firms offering sewing services, more firms producing burglar bars? And the point is that the number of startups and the number of small farms is enormous. What do we know about these small firms? They fail. They're huge turnover. They don't need, state policy doesn't need to come in. When state policy comes in to offer subsidized credit to small firms, they usually don't get paid back and the firms fail. That's the truth. So what do you want to do to improve the prospects of small firms? Well, I tell you what I think is the best policy. It's to increase the rate of growth of employment in large firms. If I look at a map of where small firms have done well, they've done well in the environment and close to where there's a fast rate of growth of wage and salaried employment by large firms. Because it's the large firms that buy the new shirts and sewed things. It's the large firms that buy, the employees of large firms that buy the burglar bars and so on. So the best thing you can do to create demand and sustain the life of small firms is encourage the rate of growth of wage employment in large firms. I would like to say much, much more about this, but I'm not going to, because I want you all to spend a sleepless night looking forward to what I say about poverty tomorrow, because that's the theme of my my lecture tomorrow. How to cope with tacit knowledge, with asymmetric information, with the difficulty of importing technology off the shelf. I really don't think there's any alternative other than learning by doing and making mistakes. I mean, mistakes are terrific. You know, you will suffer because you don't know how to do things and you make mistakes. But hopefully next time, as the poet and playwright said, you will fail better. So I think that's my general feeling about it. The question that Pamela raised about reciprocal power and competition commissions and legislations against anti-competitive behavior. It's not my field, it's your field. But my impression is that what the Koreans did very well, and everybody wants to look to Korea, is they threatened firms by building up their rivals and saying, okay, you Chaebol, you're not doing what we think you ought to do. You're not exporting enough. Your technology is stagnant. We're going to back your rival. And if they tended to listen to that sort of threat. And I don't see that as a concerted strategy in any African countries, but I think it's terribly important. I think people believe the textbooks and think that you have competition, intense competition, if you have lots of firms competing against one another. Absolutely not true. The most intense competition is oligopolistic competition, well established by economic theorists. And what you need is to build up rivals and threaten firms. Do what we, the planning authority, want, or we'll give our support to your rival.
Thank you very much for that. I'm first going to take the hand that is online, and then we'll read one or two more questions that would come in for online. Will you please unmute Bernard?
Thank you very much. Thanks to Professor Sender for a very interesting lecture. I wondered whether he could confirm that he's supporting the view that we should be supporting winners in South African manufacturing in particular, especially in respect to exports. And as he said, I think our experience is that we've seen SMMEs growing up around the bigger companies. Since 1994, we've been chanting this mantra about SMMEs are going to be our saviors, but there's very little evidence that that has in fact happened. And where SMEs do grow up, as John has said, it tends to be around big companies. But when he's talking about supporting the bigger companies, the larger manufacturers, does he think that public procurement, which supports the growth of sustainable manufacturing sectors, should be part of the strategy? Niva Makgetla has just written an excellent paper on the subject. And I must comment also that South African firms have shown that they're able to use advanced technology productively and competitively. The biggest problem that we seem to be facing, I've been working with the DTI and the IDC on the steel and steel products master plan, is that the very low volumes mean that we're using a small percentage of capacity. And if we could increase the capacity utilization, we'd increase the competitiveness. That seems to be one of the major factors in our current problems of competitiveness rather than just the technology issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernard, for that question. Professor Sen, I'd like you to hold that and think about that. I understand that Dr. Mondi is now online. Nomgele, can you please give us your input? I don't know how much of the presentation or the discussion you've been able to hear such that you're able to provide inputs.
Thank you so much, Pamela. Good evening to everyone, and apologies for being late. I just want to make a few comments because John was very kind to me to share his talk this evening. I think I must firstly commend the work that's being done by the DTIC as far as industrialization in targeted sectors is concerned. Specifically here, in trying to debunk the argument around creating rivalries that John was talking to earlier. I think the DTI accidentally or by serendipity is trying to do that work very effectively. One of the businesses that I'm engaged with, supported by the DTI through the Black Industrialists program, and supported by an OEM in terms of market access, a foreign EM for that matter, does exceptional work in terms of working with this Black-owned manufacturing firm, which is a small medium enterprise, to access international market. So the view that given the destruction of part of our capability because of the choices that South Africa made after 1994, and therefore South Africa is experiencing deindustrialization and therefore should shift towards services and have an industrial policy focused on services, I think is a very misleading view, given that despite the challenges in some areas, the knowledge that had been built under the apartheid ecosystem, there's still some remnants of it, which are becoming of value in this process, particularly in the exploitation and the development of new industries going forward. Specifically, if you look in the EV sector, the opportunities that lay ahead for South Africa with the endowment on vanadium and the role that many players working with international players, companies like Panasonic and others, to try and develop capability here, are some of the indications to us that despite the energy challenges, which were cornerstone of industrial competitiveness, despite the power outages, that South Africa stands in a position through the state supporting these industries and targeting them where it can without using the procurement system, because we think that the support to work with private sector seems to work much more effectively than the support where the small medium enterprises that depend on the state procurement system, given the experiences that we all saw in the Zondo Commission. The second issue I want to make, which I think is critical for South Africa, relates also to the access to the port and rail infrastructure system, which also has brought in a lot of challenges for some of these small medium enterprises who are linked to these OEMs in the auto sector, which highlights a huge opportunity cost for South Africa. We saw yesterday that Transnet at last has brought in a local company to work on to fix the rail system. I think a lot of our challenges in our industrialization relate to those backbone institutions which are in the state hands, which were enablers for a number of SMEs to access domestic markets and compete domestically among themselves, but at the same time, those that had capability to export internationally. And I think until we resolve those logistic power issues, our industrialization process can be compromised, not because it doesn't have capability of rising, but it needs those other support systems to be working so that we can use the knowledge that we've gained over 100 years of industrialization in the South African economic space. For the rest of the continent, really, there lies the opportunity for South African manufacturers. We know that VW, for example, assembles quite a lot in the auto sector of some of the 4x4 models in Rwanda to serve the East African market. But I think South African companies can do more. But that requires a change in kicking back the belief that has emerged from the Washington linked institution around many African countries, because they are so much service-based that there's no space for them for industrialization. It requires that push for that transfer of knowledge and working together using South African industrial base and linkages to the rest of its market in the continent to create and strengthen the existing manufacturing capabilities. I stop there.
Thank you very much, Lukile, for that input. I would like to read out two more questions from online that Professor Sender could respond to, together with the question that was posed by Bernard earlier, and then we can continue with the discussion. So one of the questions was asking, there's a great opportunity to develop agri-info skills in rural areas in preparation for the carbon economy. How do African countries quickly develop related curricula to be able to take up these opportunities? So that's the one question. And then the second question was asking, and I think it may be similar to a previous question that's been asked, if you see any chances of countries that don't yet have large enterprises with a track record to be able to adopt these strategies for growth.
Sorry, could you just repeat the last
one? So the last one is saying, do you see a chance for countries, African countries that do not yet have large firms, to be able, large firms with a track record, to be able to build up firms following the strategies that you are recommending?
Thanks very much for all the questions to everyone who's posed them. Do them in the order, maybe leave out some of them, partly because I've forgotten what they were or didn't hear them properly, but you'll have to forgive me. I like Bernard's point about capacity utilization. I think that, again, sort of looking at world economic history, countries that grow fast and do well and reduce poverty, etc., tend to have high levels of investment, which are sustained by high levels of aggregate demand and high levels of capacity utilization. In other words, they grow fast because the environment is one in which capacity is fully utilized, that you're pushing, demand is high. And I think that is the environment in which new technologies, new innovations, in which the pressure to innovate becomes real politically and economically. So I'm in favor of pressure. I'm in favor of high and sustained levels of aggregate demand. I don't like the IMF's macroeconomic policies because they don't work anywhere. And not that I have any bias against particular economists. For Lum, I'll pick out one of the things he said again that I particularly liked. I like the emphasis on ports infrastructure very much. I like that as a central part of any meaningful industrial strategy. However, I think there are going to be choices. In other words, you're going to build or improve the transport infrastructure. Where are you going to start and what are you going to do first? Well, I think that what you ought to do first is make sure that people are exporting, who can generate foreign exchange, can get their exports to market. So if you're deciding where to improve the railway, why not look at Letzitalat, Zanin, and railway links for orange exports and avocados and so on. This is a fast rate of growth in world demand and export revenue. And if you're going to choose between that and, I don't know, building and improving a tarred road to some important personalities' residence, you know, I would go for the export choice. So two things when deciding on your priorities, or at least two things. One, what does it do for exports as investment? And two, what does it do for employment? I think the things that do the most tend to be agribusiness. This is the argument that Chris and I have been making for some time in South Africa and elsewhere. Agricultural skills was a question somebody raised for the Green Revolution and the sort of skills that are required and what can be done to increase them. I like very much the work of an economist who, I don't know if she's still here, Stephanie Elias, on the skills situation in sub-Saharan Africa. She argues that almost all TVET is a complete waste of time. And when governments intervene to create skills training programs, they're wasting money. I think there's a lot of evidence to support that, despite the fact that huge amounts of government effort do go into training. I think that when jobs arise, say, in the horticultural sector, people will start to get qualifications in horticulture because they know that will be the basis for obtaining employment. In other words, once it's the supply of wage jobs creates a demand amongst ordinary people for training, and they'll go to the ends of the earth to obtain it because they know that it will lead to something. Choices for African states who don't have large-scale enterprises successful with a track record of success in export markets. Well, they have a distribution, a size distribution of firms, some of which are larger than others. They may not be very large and they may not be very successful, but if you're going to begin to prioritize, you can surely find some that have a better track record and are larger than others.
Thank you very much, Professor Sender, for that. Are there any other questions from the audience here? There was a question at the front that I didn't take in the previous round.
Thank you very much. My comment is that if you look at why some of the skepticism from Harvard and the other authors, I think that probably, I don't know, I'm just guessing, they look at some of the prevailing conditions that we create for ourselves. As Africans, I have observed across the continent that in many cases, the businesses do not last beyond 20 years. And that is because it's self-inflicted. You realize that most of the business in Africa have to battle many of the unfavorable, I call them headwinds, macroeconomic headwinds. They don't see stability in things like exchange rate, inflation, and all of that. And within 10, 15 years, they collapse because it becomes very, very expensive to do business within the environment. And secondly, most of the business are also killed by politicians themselves because they have a feeling that these businesses are financing their opposition in one way or the other. It might not be happening in South Africa, but it's a reality in most of the, because South Africa usually is an outlier in Africa, we must admit it. They are level in terms of the finance, the economy is an outlier. They tend to resemble more of the advanced economies than the counterparts in Africa. And therefore, when I speak, it's not about South Africa. They are up there. And I remember when I was doing a particular, I had to take South African data out because it's an outlier in the data. So my point is, it is the environment we have created for ourselves as Africans, where businesses have to face inflation rate as high as 50 and above %. Who does business in such an environment? Our currencies are more or less bananas, and we tend to hope that our businesses can compete globally, and the politicians, instead of fixing this, would rather work for handout, to Bretton Woods institutions for handout, where they will prescribe certain policies that do not work. All the businesses are asking for is that give us a stable macroeconomic environment and they can thrive. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that comment. I don't know if you want to comment on that. I wanted to express a few thoughts myself. That is, if I'm not taking space from the audience, if there are any new questions, I'd rather do that than make my own comments. But I do have some comments that I wanted to make. I mean, I think there has been a lot of work and deep work that's been done around what's happening on the continent, and not just in South Africa. And we've seen African multinationals come up who are able to export. And that has been said and has been highlighted by Prof. Senda. This is not an easy process, and it has all the challenges that have been described here, but it's happened before. So even in the case of South Africa, where everyone is saying, the reciprocal mechanisms aren't working, there was a period where they worked. So the insights and the lessons are there for how we could leverage those. And when we've looked at the kind of like the data around what's happening in a range of countries, but focusing more around upper middle income countries, I think the evidence is still quite clear that a structuralist approach is still necessary. Now, we've seen in South Africa firms that used to be small firms that grew to being medium firms and large firms over time, due to a range of a combination of state support plus investments by the firms themselves. And even where there are issues in a country like South Africa, there's a large skills issue, but you've had companies that are designing mining machinery and equipment that's internationally competitive, and they've unfortunately had to find their own solutions, for those particular problems. So I think we really mustn't take a negative approach to that. There are examples, there is evidence. The Dangote Group is doing so many things, not just in Nigeria. They invested in South Africa. They've invested in a number of other African countries. We're seeing exciting things that are happening on the technological front in Kenya, right? And these are developments that are nuanced for those particular environments that can hopefully be upscaled and used more broadly, either on the continent or elsewhere. And we've seen some great innovations that have come out of this country. We struggle a little bit with commercialization, but where there has been quite a bit of research and development. So now everyone is talking about electric vehicles. We had an electric vehicle that we developed many years ago, I think it was 2008, that was going around. So that research capability is there, and the products were there. We were doing early research on battery technology. And if we think about even now that China is a leader in battery technologies, they realized that they weren't going to dominate ICE vehicles. So they invested before everyone else in electric batteries, and they are now a leader. So there are opportunities and strategies to be able to scale up. And the question I think I'd like to pose to Professor now, so we're at a period now where the world is changing so much that it is a place where we are more or less at the same place, and that is developed countries versus developing countries. So everyone is trying to either decarbonize or adapt. There are particular technologies that they could be developed in Africa with that perspective, or could be adapted in Africa. So I wanted to know, how do you see this moment in terms of everyone being more or less at the same place? Granted, the global West, has more money, but there are opportunities and particular things, particularly around agriculture, I think. The industrialization within the agricultural production and the scope of what it could do to support more employment than we've seen on the continent. Thanks.
Once again, thanks for interesting, provocative questions, provocative to me anyway. This short, the businesses don't last for a long time in Africa. The firms have a life of less than 20 years. There's quite a churning of firms in other countries. And I don't know how exceptional Africa is. I know that small enterprises in Africa don't last for 5 minutes, but I'm not sure the large firms in Africa are, I mean, you may be right, I don't know. I didn't like your phrase headwinds, because that suggests something natural, the heavens are against you. I think you were saying something else, and that is that the difficulties that large-scale firms in Africa face are often policy-induced by states in Africa. They're not caused by natural calamities or by geography or by the foreign horrible people. They're caused by really serious policy mistakes within Africa. And I think that's just honest and right. And it's optimistic also, because if it's those policies that have caused the problems, then you have a clear political task ahead of you. It's not, oh my God, the wind has come again. It's, you can say, well, I know how to change these policies. I get rid of these people and try to get better policies. So it's politically more progressive, I think. Pamela, I mean, I agree with you very much. There was a time when South African state was very successful in supporting internationally world-class, large-scale parastatal organizations. We all know their names, and we all know that some of them have more or less disappeared, either by going abroad or by looting of, when I was first working in detail on the South African economy in the early 1990s, I remember seeing a World Bank report on Eskom. And of course, the World Bank wanted to say Eskom is not very good and should be privatized. And that's what they came to do in the early 1990s. And if you read the report, they said, well, we've benchmarked Eskom against the best electricity generating firms in the world, and Eskom is at least as good, if not better. And they were good. What can I say about decarbonization, adaptation, green? Well, I'm frightened because we've got Paul here and lots of other people who take these things very seriously. All I can say is the following, that if everybody is saying something, and in particular if the orthodox mainstream is supporting something, if you can get lots of research grants to look at transformation for the green economy, then my tendency as a lifelong iconoclast is to say there must be something wrong with this stuff. And I think there probably is, and it's a fad that will pass.
Thank you, Professor Sen. I think on that note, we can close the session for today. Thank you very much to everyone who's come to join the session in person, as well as those that are joining from online. Have a good evening.